Welcome to the first podcast of the Domox.com, a website dedicated to the exploration of Thomistic philosophy. Today we're looking at Etienne Gilson's Thomistic response to skepticism. Gilson was a 20th century Thomistic philosopher who argued for methodical or direct realism. He takes his view to be a faithful rendering of Thomas Aquinas' own view and one which answers both skepticism, idealism, and its precursor, critical realism. In this video, we will begin with a look at the historical roots of skepticism and move from there to consider Gilson's answer. We will conclude by thinking about how Gilson's Thomistic response to skepticism could be valuable today. First, let's talk about skepticism. In Kenneth Gallagher's excellent epistemology text, The Philosophy of Knowledge, he begins by discussing the status of knowing in light of what is called the problem of knowledge. How can we be certain that our beliefs are true? And how can we justify what we claim to know? As he raises this question, he takes time to consider one of its answers, skepticism, the idea that the problem of knowledge is so serious that, as skeptics claim, we should resist knowledge claims. So, taking our cue from Gallagher, let's consider skepticism. According to philosophybasics.com, skepticism, also known as Pyrrhonism or Pyrrhonic skepticism, after the early proponent Pyrrho of Elis, is the philosophical position that one should refrain from making truth claims and avoid the postulation of final truths. This is not necessarily quite the same as claiming that truth is impossible, which would itself be a truth claim, but is often also used to cover the position that there is no such thing as certainty in human knowledge, sometimes referred to as academic skepticism. Putting skepticism in its historical context, we learn that skepticism in Western thought is a product of ancient Greece. The term skepticism is derived from the Greek verb skeptomai, which means to look carefully, to reflect. And the early Greek skeptics were known as the skeptikoi. In everyday usage, skepticism refers to an attitude of doubt or incredulity, either in general or toward a particular object, or to any doubting or questioning attitude or state of mind. It is effectively the opposite of dogmatism, the idea that established beliefs are not to be disputed, doubted, or diverged from. Skepticism has a lofty philosophical pedigree. It is fair to say that Socrates himself, the greatest of the philosophers of ancient Greece, saw skepticism as a virtuous mental attitude. In the Apology, Plato has Socrates say, "I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing, and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. In this latter particular, then, I seem to have slightly the advantage of him." As mentioned in our first slide, skepticism is also known as Pyrrhonism after its founding father, Pyrrho of Elis, who lived from 365 to 270 BC. Sextus Empiricus, a later student of Pyrrhonism and author of Outlines of Pyrrhonism, attributes the following statement to Pyrrho as representative of his doctrine of skepticism. Things are equally indifferent, unmeasurable, and undecidable. For this reason, neither our sensations nor our opinions tell us truth or falsehood. Notice Pyrrho does not believe, given what Kant would later call the antinomies of life, that we can know either what is true or what is false. But like many skeptics, at least as this quote is framed, he does believe that his position of skepticism is true or right, or that he can positively affirm his position of skepticism as objectively true. In this statement is revealed the common failure of skepticism, which is justifiably raised as a reductio ad absurdum defeater of skepticism, namely that the problem of knowledge and the case for skepticism cannot be consistently raised. For to be a skeptic, one must affirm that he cannot affirm. One knows that he cannot know, and one seeks to persuade others that his position is right, that we cannot know that any position is right. Now we want to introduce the position of Etienne Gilson and his Thomistic response to skepticism. This response is set forth in his most important work, Realisme Thomiste, published in 1939. Gilson, a 20th century Thomist philosopher, argues in his work that skepticism cannot be consistently raised. Gallagher summarizes Gilson's case in the following 3 points. First, Gallagher says there is no problem of knowledge since the critical question cannot be consistently raised. Gallagher explains it this way. That is why the position of the absolute skeptic is the most vulnerable in the whole domain of philosophy. What the absolute skeptic contends is that man's mind is incapable of attaining truth, that we can know nothing for an objective certainty but are confined to the free play of our own subjective opinions. Unfortunately for him, however, the very attempt to express his position involves him in a denial of it, for he holds at least one judgment to be objectively true, his own. He holds it as objectively true and not a mere subjective opinion that man cannot know objective truth. He is certain that he cannot be certain. The traditional accusation that the skeptical position is self-nullifying and literally absurd seems fully justified. No matter how he twists and turns, the skeptic cannot help implicitly denying what he is explicitly affirming. Suppose he contents himself with merely doubting whether our thoughts put us in touch with reality. Even so, he does not escape inconsistency, for this doubt of his is not a frame of mind in which he merely happens to find himself. It is, he maintains, the correct position, and he argues with me that I ought to give up my dogmatism and espouse his conscientious refraining from judgment. Yet to hold his position as correct or right is to believe that in this one case he has reached the objective state of affairs and seen what the proper response to it is. Notice, Gilson's argument is that knowledge is unconditionally attached to being. Following Aquinas, Gilson argues that being is the first principle of human knowledge. By this he means that the human conjunctum of soul and body as a knowing subject receives sensory inputs from existent objects. To deny the existence of the external object, we would first have to sense its existence. Furthermore, being is logically a precursor of the fundamental principle of metaphysics that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time. The principle of non-contradiction depends on the first principle of being. Together, these two principles imply that to doubt the existence of a sensed object is to affirm that we cannot know that an object exists that we know exists. Thus, the question, according to Gilson, cannot be consistently raised. Next, Gallagher points our attention to the logically entailed and corresponding claim that to avoid inconsistency in our thinking, we must begin with the presumption of the existence of the external world and its sensible objects, which is the starting point of classical realism. According to Gilson, in his account of classical realism, we cannot prove or demonstrate the existence of the external world. Rather, we take it as given in the same way that we take it that we should use reason to arrive at knowledge as given, or that the principle of non-contradiction should underlie all of our metaphysics as given, etc. This is the beginning presumption of realism, and without it we will end up in the error of skepticism or idealism, each of which is inconsistent and a dead end. Finally, according to Gilson, realism does not need to be justified. Rather, it is the only consistent way to approach knowledge. By properly functioning senses, we all see the existence of other objects, and we gain knowledge of the existence of other objects via our sense inputs and the use of reason. For Gilson, there is no reason to doubt these knowledge conclusions. In holding this position, Gilson is indeed a faithful Thomist. His classical realism deliberately recapitulates the doctrine of Aquinas regarding knowledge. It should be noted that for Aquinas there was no problem of knowledge. Aquinas was not concerned with whether we have knowledge. It was obvious to him that we have knowledge. Instead, he was concerned with how we come to have knowledge. Aquinas' realism can be described in the following way. Aquinas generally trusts the human sensory apparatus as a reliable means of acquiring knowledge about the external world. He believed that the mind has the capacity to discern and abstract information from the senses, allowing it to differentiate between valid perceptions and potential distortions. While he acknowledged that senses can be defective or misleading in some instances, he held that under normal conditions our senses provide a direct and generally veridical connection to reality. In holding this realist line, Gilson was responding not only to ancient skepticism, but also to what might be called the critical turn in modern philosophy, which was ushered in by René Descartes in his Meditations on First Philosophy. As Descartes sought an indubitable ground of knowledge, he had arrived at the now famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Taking his own thought to be the only certain ground of knowledge, Descartes set out to make his way out of the isolation of subjectivism or solipsism in which he found himself trapped by the cogito. He did this, of course, by arguing to the existence of a perfect God via reason alone, and from this God to the veridicality of sense experience. Since his time, however, it has been shown that Descartes' argument fails, and so does his escape from subjectivism. His critical realism, so called, is, in the final analysis, a variety of idealism. He is no different from the skeptic in his ability to know reality. Here Gilson argues that to begin with Descartes is inevitably to end up with Berkeley or Hume. One cannot begin with critical realism and end up with anything other than idealism. For Gilson, what this shows is that we must start with the indemonstrable presumption of realism. Otherwise, we will forever be trapped in subjectivism or skepticism. So what does this mean for modern skepticism? Can we know the external world today? Pyrrhonism is still alive and well. One of its most prolific representatives today is Matt Dillahunty. One quote attributed to Dillahunty is this: "The people who are constantly striving to apply skepticism to everything in their lives, the ones who actually care enough about truth and care to try to avoid being wrong and biased and prejudiced and clueless, those are the people we need and need to be." Notice that Gilson's criticism applies here too. Dillahunty, who opposes knowledge claims, makes a claim about the kind of people we should be. If this quote is accurate, it demonstrates Gilson's point. We cannot consistently raise the problem of knowledge or the claims of skepticism. We will soon find ourselves borrowing from the realists their principle of non-contradiction and their principle of being. Gilson's argument is still effective today. The question of the problem of knowledge cannot be consistently raised. We must begin with a presumption of realism. Any attempt to justify realism already represents a concession, if not a surrender. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.